Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, Haiyan swamps the Philippines. The international media come in waves. The coverage of the disaster and what came next. Freelancers are playing a bigger and bigger role in the news coverage you watch, particularly a story like Syria. Toronto's mayor clings to his day job, but a news channel that gave him his own program cracks under the pressure and takes him off the air. And out of Africa, the typical aid video is in fact stereotypical.
Is this your first charity appeal?
It's our web video of the week. When a natural disaster strikes, coverage in the international media tends to follow a familiar arc. Journalists arrive in numbers and immediately report on the aftermath and the casualty figures. Then the focus shifts to the relief operation before the story becomes about the desperate measures taken by those affected and too often the failures of those responsible for helping them. The coverage of Typhoon Haiyan, known in the Philippines as Yolanda, has followed that pattern. This was an historic storm, the biggest land typhoon ever recorded. That made it an enormously challenging story for the Filipino media to cover. And when legions of foreign correspondents parachuted into the disaster zone, they were on the air within hours, trying to make sense of the story and provide accurate reports at a time when information and misinformation were coming at them in a fast and furious way. Disaster stories also provide a window into the relationship between the news media and humanitarian organizations, which is usually symbiotic but can be adversarial. Our starting point this week is Tacloban in the Philippines, where they're picking up the pieces under the watchful eye of the global media.
Close eye on Typhoon Haiyan over the last few days.
Top dozen of all storms ever seen on this planet.
The media hierarchy of disasters is simple. It's all about how far away it's happened, how easy it is for journalists to get there, how dramatic the pictures are, and how connected we feel to the people there. So something like Typhoon Haiyan ticked all these boxes.
Journalists, the good ones, tend to go against the flow. And when there's a disaster, be it man-made or natural, you can see them taking the same roads that victims use to get out in order to get in, to tell the story in conditions that thousands are fleeing.
The biggest problem really was security and logistics. The most difficult really is logistics, really finding a way to not only be able to communicate with your editors on the ground, but also to really find ways to protect yourself, protect the gear that you have. Also technology. I mean, despite all the latest means to really send your feeds, you are still at the mercy of the power of nature and very much limited with whatever you can provide and produce.
We chartered in, so the only way of getting in was on a small plane. Got into Tacloban and absolute devastation. We had to take everything in with us. So we took in petrol, we took in generators, we took in food, we took in water. There was nothing you could rely on the ground. Touchdown in Tacloban, the airport was like something out of a disaster movie.
This was no movie. In the early hours of the coverage, the casualty figures were all over the place. At a time when the confirmed death toll was around 1,000, reports circulated that it was actually 10 times higher than that.
10,000 people in the Philippines are believed to have been killed.
More or less 10,000.
10,000 people killed.
That figure, which was eventually traced to one single policeman, was way off. Eventually, it was revised downward, but not before being reported around the world. Television journalism is often criticized for its addiction to images. The coverage of natural disasters can also be over-reliant on the numbers.
Unfortunately, death toll is still the biggest indicator of the magnitude of the disaster, which is a big mistake. And it's a big mistake because you are going to have, in some cases, disasters that they are not such a big killers in the first moment, but are going to be affecting to millions of people. And they will have rough years to come. But because international aid is attached in some cases, or international attention is attached to the death toll, they get less media attention.
What is the motivation to exaggerate the number of people dead or the number of people affected in a natural disaster? Well, that's quite simple. It's money and it's attention. And this is true for both media and aid agencies. The bigger the number, the bigger the story for the media. The bigger the number, the more likely that there's going to be more aid given for the aid agencies. But really, both sides have to be very careful, because the problem is, if this turns out not to be the case, then the news viewer feels cheated. So mistakes can happen. Often the numbers aren't accurate to start off with. But if they do turn out to be incorrect, then it's up to the aid agencies, it's up to the media to try and correct them as soon as possible to keep that trust with the viewers.
When international journalists are parachuted into a story, into a country they may not be familiar with, the challenge is all the greater. And usually, that country is hurting. Its people and political leaders are sensitive to critical coverage. CNN's Anderson Cooper landed in Tacloban 5 days into the story and reported a lack of government support for the victims.
People are desperate. People do not have any place for shelter.
And he was chastised for that by a radio journalist, Corina Sanchez. Cooper responded by pointing out that Sanchez was a long way away from the disaster zone. She was in Manila, and that paradoxically, she was too close to the story.
Ms. Sanchez is welcome to go there, and I would urge her to go there. I don't know if she has, but her husband's the Interior Minister. I'm sure she could arrange a flight.
Her response was agenda-driven, mainly because, family ties and things like that. But Anderson Cooper did an excellent job. And from my observation on social media, a lot of overseas Filipinos have really rapped about that. They thank him immensely.
As picture-driven and number-driven as disaster reporting can be, the words still matter. When the BBC's Tim Wilcox used the term apocalyptic to describe what he saw, he was advised by his editors in London to use another word. Journalists have also been questioned about describing scenes like these as looting, the dictionary definition of which is to steal goods from a place, typically during a war or riot.
Well, one doesn't use the word loot lightly, but it's pretty clear when prisoners, for example, were released because nobody was there to look after them and there was no food or whatever, there was a real law and order issue. And people who hadn't had anything to drink or eat would then go to shops and warehouses and try and access that food for themselves. Now, that is described as looting. That is looting.
You can use the word looting, but you've got to contextualize why looting is occurring. You've got to explain the situation they're in. To just call victims looters is also in many ways doing them injustice.
Evidence has emerged of looting in the Philippines.
To call the government a failure, you've got to explain why. Again, in the case of Typhoon Haiyan, those looters that have been called looters, in fact, have become just victims, really, who are in desperate situations and who had to find ways to feed their families.
And what happens is that you can really affect people's perceptions. This was seen most strongly in Hurricane Katrina, where you saw pictures of both white families and black families, and the captions of these pictures were very different. The white families were seen as fending for their families. The black families were portrayed as being looters. And that had a really big effect on how Hurricane Katrina was seen and how the survivors of Hurricane Katrina was seen. And it was a bad journalistic cliche to fall into.
1 week after the storm hit, President Benigno Aquino had this to say to the media covering the story. Use your role to uplift the spirits of the Filipino people, to find stories of resilience, of hope and faith, and show the world how strong the Filipino people are. That same day, Aquino's government reported that in that first week, it had delivered 50,000 emergency food packs to the storm's victims. That amounts to just 3% of the 1.7 million people affected. The rest have been left to rely on resilience, hope, faith, and the media to tell their story. Our Global Village Voice is now on the coverage of the typhoon in the Philippines.
During the first few days, we had to rely to international and social